Good. I think we'll kick off at that, will we?
I was going to say so too. Yes, that says it 2 minutes past. So yes, thank you everybody for joining, and I'm just going to swiftly hand over to Neil, our chair for this evening.
Brilliant. Thanks, April. Welcome to this afternoon's North East Scotland SFTT meeting. We have two main presentations this evening by Neil Stoddart at Keele Maritime and Chris Quinn at Forest Research, and in between, April's also going to give us a brief introduction to the Scottish Finest Woods Awards. Before we kick off, just like to say thank you to Scottish Forestry, who fund the SFTT events, and obviously a thanks to April and the Confor team who support the events and basically put everything together for us. There'll be opportunity for questions at the end of each of the presentations, so if you want to put some any questions you have in the chat, I think April and Eleanor will start pulling out some of the key questions, and we'll get an opportunity to introduce them at the end. So without any further ado, we'll just kind of crack on. Neil Stoddart's on a tight time schedule. So Neil is Director of Keele Maritime. I say founder as well, probably something you'd like to be called. He's going to give us a talk on the decarbonising of timber haulage, quite an apt subject. This week is the UK's National Decarbonising Transport Week. So that's just looking at highlighting solutions used to deliver kind of the bigger gains in the transition to a lower carbon transport environment. And Neil's also the recent award of the Net Zero Award at the recent Confor dinner. So without further ado, Neil, I will leave it to you.
Right, thanks very much, Neil. Just to check first and foremost, everyone can hear me okay. There'll be someone who can test that. I'm sure it's fine. I'm really going to share a couple of presentations. One is a very short video, which was put together for the Timber Transport Forum conference back in March. So apologies if you're at that, you'll have seen it already. And then it's a very similar presentation that I gave to that same audience. So I'll crack on. Unfortunately, I am on a bit of a tight time scale. We're loading a ship today up in Aberdeen, so I've got to hightail it up there later on today. So hopefully, by the wonders of modern technology, I can start to share this, and I'll play this video first. That just gives you an idea of some of the trucks that are being looked at, some of the research and technology going on by the major manufacturers, and the text just highlighted some of the constraints and challenges. So I'll jump on now, as long as everyone can hear me okay with my the main part of my presentation.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Good, good, good. Okay, can everyone see that? You see that okay, Neil?
Yep, that's good, Neil.
Brilliant, right, thanks very much. So yeah, this talk is going to be about decarbonising timber haulage, and just showing you again, as mentioned in that video, some of the challenges, constraints, timings, technology, and where the industry is going with this. So just a wee bit of background about myself. Many of you will know me, I'm sure, or might have heard my name, certainly on the websites this last few days after gratefully winning an award last week at the Con4 dinner, which was great crack. So I came out of the University of Highlands and Islands, or Scottish School of Forestry, as it was known back then, an HND back in '94. I've been on a fair journey in my career, been involved with lots of innovative projects, dealt with my fair share of accidents and, unfortunately, fatalities. I've seen grown men cry, and I've also measured saw logs growing in crops that are planted back in the Lake District in 89, 90. So that makes you feel old, I can assure you. So on to the meat of this presentation. All of us really have to stop and think about this, and it's time to wake up. Both the Scottish and the UK governments have set ambitious net zero targets, and because of the amount of carbon it makes up, the successful decarbonisation of transport is central to these goals. Transport represents 36% of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. So really, to achieve anything meaningful, it means shutting off the sales of internal combustion engine powered cars by 2030 and doing the same for light duty vehicles 2035, HGVs by 2040, which is under review and will most likely be 2035 as well. Really what we're trying to do here is turn the clock back on 120 years of development of both internal combustion engines, but more importantly, perhaps, the infrastructure that supports that. So we've been developing these engines and the infrastructure for 120 years. We're going to have to turn that around in the next 10. I really can't think of anything more challenging. It's a huge subject, and it really is a bit of a brain fryer. So I'm going to zip through this fairly quickly. Scotland has an overall very ambitious net zero emissions target date of 2045. I'm sure there's a Green Party influence in that, and no harm in that, but that is ahead of many other countries. So if we're going to get anywhere near that, we're going to have to put a positive foot forward, and very quickly. In terms of figures, looking across the UK, the combined annual output CO2 through timber haulage, it's about 69,000 tonnes. That is a lot of CO2. And per truck annually, that's around 93 tonnes of CO2. So quite a lot we're pumping out there. Just a wee breakdown, which won't surprise you, follows the kind of annual harvest figures from each of these countries. So Scotland, we're at 2/3, the balance shared by England and Wales. Currently, the UK truck fleet by fuel type, well, 98% diesel says it all. Fair enough, this is 2019. It won't have moved by very much since then. Very small percentage petrol, hybrid electric 0.1%, natural gas 0.6%, electric 0%, and others 0.3%. That electric figure will be creeping up, but I'd be surprised if it was over 1% yet. So we have got a long, long way to go in a very short space of time. Of course, there's lots of barriers to the introduction of zero emission trucks. Some of the main ones are cost. I'm going to touch on a project we're running later on in this presentation, but just to give you a sort of headline figure, if you were going to replace a standard 6x2 tag axle tractor unit capable of a gross tonnage of 44 tonnes, so very similar to your average timber truck, you might be able to get a Volvo or a Scania tractor unit with no bells or whistles on it for about 120,000. Same specification EV truck will be a minimum, if not more, 2.5 times that cost, certainly knocking on the door of 300. So straight away for your haulier to go out and swap his current diesel truck for an EV truck is a massive increase in capex cost. Technology readiness, well, charging is one thing. Monitoring of EV trucks, is the infrastructure in place? Doubtful, but we could probably move quite quickly on that. Infrastructure and supplying the fuel, that's another issue. I was recently down in Wales at a meeting. They're sort of bypassing electric at the moment, looking at hydrogen, simply because there isn't currently an electric cabling infrastructure backwards and forwards, up, down across Wales that allows them to transfer a lot of power, or certainly increase the amount of power. So we ain't going to see a very strong EV network in Wales. So they're looking, can they use this energy from wind turbines, offshore turbines, and put that through an electrolyzer straight to hydrogen, because there isn't the way or means to transfer the electricity around. Vehicle availability, that's probably at the bottom of the barriers, because I was out in Gothenburg October this year. The likes of Volvo, Scania will be the same. Starting, if you order a diesel V8 Scania, you're probably looking at 12 months waiting list. If you were to order something in an EV format, that could be down to 3 or 4 months, because they're starting to realign their factory production in terms of lower carbon EV and other methods. So they have to start now. The manufacturers are under heavy penalties from the EU if they aren't producing electric or alternative fuel trucks. So they are on the march. So vehicle availability probably won't be the biggest issue. Of course, it's not just about what we want to do or what the government wants to do to push this forward, but there is a lot of perception from the guys at the coalface and the drivers of these trucks. Everyone likes to have a big timber truck, high carb. If you're a Scania driver, you're certainly not going to settle for anything less than a V8 if you can get away with it. And I mean, Scania, a bit like Harley Davidson, have got owners, if you like, drivers who tattoo their branding on themselves. I mean, you can't get a stronger brand than that. So there's plenty of Scania V8 t-shirts out there. Of course, Volvo have hit back with their 750 horse FH16. So again, if you're a Volvo driver, you want the biggest and the best. They've gone one further now, up to 770. Oh, sorry, Scania came back at Volvo, so you now get a 770 Scania V8. So it's been a race for the highest horsepower, and all of that really is conversely different to moving to electric. So we've got a lot of change coming at us. As I said earlier, we're reversing the development for the last 120 years from both the fuel supply chain and transitioning to net zero supply chains over the next 15. And another way of looking at that is the last time that we changed, wholesale like this, we were going from coal, which was, of course, powering steam engines, and we were moving to internal combustion engines, so diesel, heavy oil, petrol. And that was an easy transition because it was cheaper, it was cleaner, and it made people's working lives much easier. And at this point in time, the change isn't really offering any of those. Okay, it's cleaner, it's certainly not easier, and it's certainly not any cheaper. So that's going to make this transition pretty difficult. So you can see there, internal combustion, let's just say diesel, we've got the feedstock, that's got to be transported, pumped through pipes, refined, then it's got to be transported again, then it goes onto the forecourts before it goes into your vehicle. So we call that little supply chain wheel to well. That's what we're looking at there. So of course we can look at it in a similar fashion for EV. We could have your feedstock. Now that could be wind turbines, it could be hydro. In this instance, the graphic is showing solar. Okay, it's got to be refined, maybe through an electrolyzer or into battery storage. Still got to be transported, but we do have those grids available. Bewley Denny has been upgraded. There's more upgrades in the pipeline, excuse the pun, and there's a lot of subsea offshore cabling work proposed. But we then got to get that power to the forecourts. And we think about forecourts for domestic users. It can be a menace. I don't drive an EV at the moment. I would if it was practical. The mileage I do per year, 40,000 miles, it probably isn't. And I don't want to be sat waiting for somebody else to move a Tesla out of the way, or worse, as a lot of people find, get to a charge point and it's not working. So there's a lot of work to do there, but that's domestically. If you take a truck fleet or even a big van fleet and you've got to get them all charged up at night, if you took, some of you will be au fait with the Longman Industrial Estate in Inverness, or Industrial Estate in Perth, or parts of Glasgow or Edinburgh. Some of these big haulage companies try and plug every vehicle in at night. All the lights would go out in the city. There just isn't the network there. The transformers aren't there. We haven't developed that far enough. So we're pushing ahead with the end product, but we don't have the backup. And that's going to take a big fiscal change and a lot of investment to push that through. So I'm just going to move briefly on to what are some of our current options out there in terms of alternative fuels. Now, I really do hope, that many of you are au fait with the first one, which is HVO, or can be called HVOD+. So this is a green diesel, hydrogenated vegetable oil. So years ago, Top Gear were running some cars on chip oil as a bit of a gimmick, but it does work. If you do it scientifically and you hydrogenate that vegetable oil, so a wee bit of ethanol added, clean it, you can reduce your CO2 emissions dramatically. Now, I've got a van in our company fleet, a small Berlingo, that's been running on HVO, no problem at all. There's no issues with the engine. Most of the big manufacturers support it. There's no effects on warranty. Your heavy duty machines, whether it be Caterpillar, Liebherr, John Deere, etc., can all accept HVO. Drawback though, of course, like anything else, it's become a bit more popular, and it is running at about 10 pence a litre dearer than standard diesel at the moment. Seems to be sitting at that. But if we're serious about this, if everyone's serious about change and we're worried about the costs of EV or the costs of hydrogen, then I guarantee you paying that 10 pence a litre now to switch to HVO is an immediate benefit. Come on to that. Liquid natural gas, well, you've been able to buy liquid natural gas trucks, Volvos, for about 5 years. A couple of fleets went on the road in the Glasgow area. Most of those trucks have been sold. There's a bit of an enclave down in South Wales, Bristol kind of catchment in that corridor. Why is it down there? Because the gas is available. No point running that truck if you can't get it. And it's become, very unpopular, a little bit awkward to fill. Definitely green. Not sure it's massively greener than HVO diesel, but it hasn't taken off. So then, of course, we've got the most popular, certainly in terms of cars, and the first of the trucks and vans coming on the market, battery electric vehicle. So, okay, it's green. The performance is pretty good. When I was in Gothenburg, the Volvo tractor unit I was driving, 666 horse. So they haven't missed a marketing trick there, 666. If you think about that, they could make it 7, they could make it 800 horsepower, but they've chosen 666. So plenty power, very easy to drive, pretty nice unit, if not expensive. So that's the current focus. Of course, that sort of truck is carrying some pretty hefty batteries, which we'll come on to. Then we've got fuel cell electric. So you're basically carrying on your vehicle, whether it be a car, pickup, van, truck, bus, train, you're carrying a small power plant in there, and you're basically taking your hydrogen and converting that into electric power. So you still have electric motors, but rather than having a heavy battery, you're carrying that energy as hydrogen. Now, if you do all the maths on that, of course, you've got to have a green hydrogen to start with, not a grey one that's come out of another process, but clean green hydrogen. So wind farm, solar, hydro through an electrolyzer, perfect. But you've got to carry that hydrogen on the vehicle, convert it as you're using it to get the energy back, and then run the electric motors. So you do lose a fair bit of efficiency through that reprocessing of the hydrogen. And then, of course, there's internal combustion engine hydrogen. JCB are the stalwarts of that. You'll have seen a lot of PR at COP26. So they're taking what we would call an existing engine block, changing the head, making some modifications, and burning the hydrogen to power pistons, and turn a cam. So probably the least cost in terms of conversion, but you're still burning it. You're still giving anything you burn has to give off emissions. I'm not wholly convinced, but I do see the benefits in terms of having to carry a mini power station with you to convert hydrogen back into electric. You're simply injecting it into an internal combustion engine block. So there might be some synergies there. It might be easier to stomach going forward. But again, there's nothing on the market available. You could buy a Hyundai SUV hydrogen. I looked at that, which is battery electric, by the way, not ICE. Looked at one last year, 85 grand, no thanks. Where could you fill it up? Grangemouth or Aberdeen, so we bit restricted. So just looking a little bit more detail at some of these. HVO, you're going to lower your NOx emissions by 30%, your particulates by 86%, and your CO2 levels by 90%. Now, tell me after in the questions what's not to like about that. You could buy that tomorrow from your local fuel supplier. You could be running your company fleet on it. You could be running your diesel car at home on it. You can be running your plant on it. Drawback 10 pence a litre dearer. I think that's a small price to pay when you see those benefits. HVO continued, so just a bit of a graphic there. So one diesel machine running on existing, standard diesel is putting out the same emissions as 10 of those machines if they were running on HVO. So it's a no-brainer, really. As I touched on earlier, there's some of the manufacturers that support HVO. You'd be struggling to find something that didn't support it. It is that good. So if you're running pickup fleets, which forestry companies are, your own Land Rover, your own Hilux pickup, get it onto HVO, and then you're on a journey. You're part of that to reducing CO2. It really is low-hanging fruit, and I'm massively surprised why it hasn't taken off. John Deere, so the banner at the top there is Gaelic for the Green Forwarder, bit of a play on words. Just a project I've been working on with JST. We are converting an 1110 forwarder to run purely on HVO. Taking it one step further, all the fluids in that forwarder will be green and biodegradable. That's everything from the gearbox oil, bogey box oil, engine oil, hydraulic oil. Everything is biodegradable, and it will be running on HVO. That machine is being specifically developed for a marine project where it's going to be near fresh water, but it just shows you what can be done. So just looking at battery electric vehicles, this is Electra, based down in Blackburn. They're taking what they call roller skate chassis. Mercedes at the moment, they buy those in, chassis cabs with no engine, but the gearbox and diffs are left in. They put in their own electric motor and their own batteries where the fuel tanks used to be. So very, very straightforward, off-the-shelf components. They've got a big stock of those. They've now got a production line running. These chassis cabs are primarily then used for refuse wagons. So you bolt on and off a peg refuse skip on the back, and away you go. And I think they've got about 80 of these out on the roads at the moment, right across that central Sheffield, Blackburn, Leeds, Manchester area. And they're managing to do a full dustbin round and back to depot in the evening, still with about 20-25% left in the battery. So everyone's delighted. So a great little company working away in the background, British company. There's several of these popping up now, but they haven't quite stepped up to where we are in the forestry sector with 44-ton gross vehicles. These are all smaller scale. So some of the advantage of battery electric technology, zero emission at the point of use. We could argue for the rest of the day, probably well into the evening, about where the heavy metals come from to fabricate those batteries. That's for another day. You've got OEM development and support. Volvo, Scania, Mercedes, Renault, they're all looking at battery, and most of them have got vehicles on the market. It's very efficient, and relatively, I'm not saying it's cheap, but relatively cheap charging and refueling infrastructure if you can connect to the power. However, I will add that can easily spiral out of control where additional infrastructure is required, such as major grid connections, substations, and transformers. So I've seen quotes of, you want to charge 5 vans on the industrial estate. The industrial estate needs a new transformer. SSE will want to charge you 400k for that. That's the worst example. So not many people are going to switch on that basis. That's just some of the chargers. All this technology is moving very, very quickly. The project we've got on the go to run 2 battery electric timber trucks, the very first chargers we priced that were 140 kilowatt hour chargers. I got a bit of a shock when we got the estimates back at 140k for one of those charging units. They're down within 18 months to around about 60 or 70k and continue to come down in price. So as with anything else, if you went and bought a widescreen telly in Curry's 5 years ago and paid £1,000 for it, you'd go in there tonight and buy one for 300 quid that was probably bigger and better. So as technology moves on, infrastructure costs will fall. Fuel cell electric engine for hydrogen, you can see quite a complicated beast. Your average quick fit fitter isn't going to be able to change very much on that. Pretty complex. Okay, as I said earlier, they're converting the hydrogen to produce the electricity. So the hydrogen is just an energy store rather than drawn from a battery. Some manufacturers are pushing this in favour of batteries. And it does offer some advantages, particularly in the long haul and heavy duty sector, where draining the battery power very quickly is going to leave you stranded. So it's acknowledged it has some advantages, as I said. It can be low density to store. You have to pack enough fuel on board. That can be difficult. So it is a challenge. Hydrogen buses, they're scampering around Aberdeen as we speak. And that can be a little bit more straightforward, because if you take a hydrogen bus and you lifted the roof off, the fuel tanks are the full length of the roof. Where you'd fit those tanks on an HGV tractor unit is a little bit more of a challenge. As I said, very little space. Also, it's stored at quite high pressure. There's a risk with that. And there can be a challenge with coupling and uncoupling some of those cables and pipes at such a high pressure. Little space for storing hydrogen. And as I noted there, in a bus, you've got the hydrogen tanks up there. There is an argument they could be stacked vertically on the back of an HGV unit. Yep, get that. But a bus is, tootling around the city for 30, 40, 50 miles, then back to base, whereas your truck is going to have to carry a lot more of those on board. So a wee bit of a graph, I'm not going to go into that, between battery electric vehicles and fuel cell. As I said earlier, you've got to look at the whole supply chain from well to wheel. So if you go from a green energy source through your distribution, through a mixture of chargers into your battery, and away you go, 75% of that energy is reaching the wheels. If you want to convert your green electric through an electrolyzer, through a process of electrolysis into hydrogen, you've got to transport that hydrogen, you've got to store the hydrogen, you're going to carry the hydrogen on the truck, then go through DC and AC conversions through a stack and back into electric power. Perhaps only 25% of that is reaching the wheels, so not so good. Hydrogen internal combustion engine, as I said, JCB, go on their website. They've fitted their engine block. I think they've built 80 or 100 of them now. Of course, once they've got that power unit refined and finalized, they can start to drop that IC unit into a multitude of their applications. So a telehandler here, could be a standard excavator, it could be a tractor. I'm sure they'll sell those engine units in the wider market, so they may appear in other tractors, they may appear in trucks. So very progressive, and they've grasped the internal combustion engine idea. However, if you ask them to buy one, they can't tell you when they're available commercially, and they certainly can't tell you the price. If I was a betting man, I'd say it'd be 2 years before there's anything commercially available. That seems to follow the general pattern. Volvo, yep, you can buy a battery electric truck today. They're looking at hydrogen. When will they have a hydrogen truck available? Possibly 2026. So hydrogen a little bit further down the line. And I've got an open mind between hydrogen, between battery electric, between hydrogen electric, hydrogen ICE, and anything else that comes along. And don't forget HVO, where I started, because if we're going to get anywhere near those targets that I mentioned at the start of this presentation, we're actually going to need a combination of all these different alternative fuels, plus new technology, plus many alternative fuels we don't need to know about. I mean, synthetic petrol fuel is being developed. It's very expensive. That would save Formula One and a lot of motorsport if it can go to synthetic fuel. At this point in time, it's probably those sorts of sectors that can afford it. But let's be honest, we're 10 years away from pressing deadlines. We're going to need all the manufacturers. We're going to need everyone. We're going to need every type of alternative fuel to get anywhere near our net zero ambitions. But please take a look at it. Please start at home and consider HVO for your own family car or for a fleet of vehicles if you run them for your business. Yeah, so as I said, if JCB crack that, somebody the size and scale of John Deere crack it, or other manufacturers, you could take that hydrogen IC and it means it can be dropped into a multitude. It's just a power pack. So we could see timber harvesters, we could see forwarders, we could see other forest machines. Probably hydrogen IC is the best bet for that, because to have battery packs on things that size make it very challenging. Eventually, hydrogen could be delivered into the forest as we deliver diesel these days, just a few modifications, but it is high pressure. It is slightly higher risk. We don't know how it's going to behave in cold. It cannot be knocked about on site like a grab can, etc. Challenges, but I'm sure, we're an innovative bunch in forestry. We will start to overcome them. I actually drove down the A9 today and saw some ploughing. That's not the photograph, but again, no reason why I would say in the coming years tractors won't be running on hydrogen. So the spectrum of activity that we use heavy plant for in forestry, internal combustion, electric, hydrogen, ICE, it's all going to find a place, but it will take time and it will be expensive. So what can we do? Got to stop making excuses. The clock's ticking, and 10 years from now, that's going to pass very, very quickly. Time flies and it'll be here before we know it. So we all need to make a start somewhere. We need to act now, whether it's with HVO, whether it's looking at electric, whether it's speaking to your contractors. The survey that Creel undertook just to find what the baseline of HGVs hauling timber, involved in round timber in the country, give or take, was about 650, 700 truck units out there. Only a very small percentage of the truck operators had given any consideration to alternative fuels. So we're going to have to change the narrative there. We're all going to have these conversations and start thinking how we're going to pay for it, because this isn't going to come cheap. What else can we do? Well, net zero timber haul, I'm glad to say, this is a wee bit dated. There's two Volvo 44-ton, one 44-ton, one 40-ton Arctic units being delivered in June of this year. Pleased to say that James Jones are taking one for use down at Lockerbie, and the other one is going to be used by Scott Log up in Inverness to move round logs from the port out to Dalcross. That's going to be a 3-year project to test and see how we get on with those trucks. We're starting off on very easy work duties, short haul, but we will start to test them out in the forest. This project is kind of almost the first of its kind in Europe. There's one other battery electric truck working in Finland, which is run by Scania as a test bed, but these are going to be working commercially. So I think we can be proud of ourselves in Scotland, actually very proud of ourselves as a sector, that we're organised. We've got the Timber Transport Forum, who've written a very good decarbonisation document. Hope you've read that. And we are putting a positive foot forward. There's no other sector in Scotland will have battery electric 44-ton Arctics on the road by this summer. So we can give ourselves a pat on the back, but we're going to need to do more than that. So really, I don't know whether I'm over time, under time. That's been a quick whistle through. Hopefully you take away the fact we are on a journey here. We're all going to have to put our shoulder to the wheel and our hand in our pockets to make this happen. But these deadlines and targets are coming pretty quick. So thank you very much for your time. I'll take a few quick questions. If you have any longer term questions or want to discuss this project or any of the things I've discussed, drop a line to April and she'll be able to take them up for me, and I'll certainly come back and happy to interact.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. That was very interesting. There's a question there in the chat, but I've got a quick question first. Obviously, a lot of talk there on the HGV element, and that's obviously the only way we're going to get timber probably out of the wood. But do you see a growth in kind of alternative modes of transport in the timber industry? Shipping, rail network?
Yeah, I mean, hey, at the moment we're pushing shipping pretty hard. Obviously, if it's been exported, it has to go by ship. But you know, Timberlink's been running on the West Coast for 20 years between Argyll and Ayrshire. That works very well. We use ships to transport from North Scotland down to the borders. That's been done. We use it from transporting from Scotland down to Wales. So we're pretty much maxing out shipping. We've looked at Caledonian Canal 12 years ago. Doesn't really work. You know, we've got constraints and barriers sharing the canal network with largely pleasure users these days. But yeah, shipping does offer that, because straight away on these bigger vessels, you're taking a short journey, maybe with 100 or 150 truckloads, putting it on a ship, let one big diesel engine do the donkey work. And as we move forward, yeah, we're looking at ammonia-powered engines. We're looking at hydrogen-powered engines for ships. So that'll all dovetail in with that. Rail, massive opportunity, just a big barrier of cost. If it wasn't for the cost, we'd be doing a lot more by rail, and that will come for sure.
Just seeing in the chat there's a one from Eleanor. Do adopters need to consider retraining costs in terms of looking at their drivers, the mechanical support? And I guess just to follow up on that, if so, is any of that been currently looked at with the trials that you're looking at? Yeah, well, fortunately, it's a good question, because it was one of our biggest worries. Listen, if you're trying to get your car booked in for a service at the moment, it can be quite a delay, and the excuse being, you know, everyone's short-staffed. Good fitters, young fitters, apprentices are hard to find. So if you try to get a diesel, a very complicated 770 horsepower diesel HGV serviced, it can be a challenge. So straight away we're thinking, well, wait a minute, if we're facing challenges with support networks and servicing for diesel, what's going to happen with electric? Fortunately, the likes of Volvo and other manufacturers have been running battery electric coaches and buses for several years. So actually the knowledge, infrastructure, charging facilities, etc., in some of their main depots and workshops is already ingrained. But yeah, will be a challenge. From an operator's point of view, yeah, there will be training to be done, possibly driving methods. They're actually easier to drive than a diesel truck. It's one pedal, you know, foot down, foot off to brake, because of your braking, you're regenerating. So they're very easy to drive, and it'll probably be more hands-off from a driver. Nobody will want their operators poking about 540 kilowatt-hour batteries. So it will be a lot more reliant on main dealers. They are going to have to step up the game. As an example, I'll just throw this in. Speaking to the MD of Volvo at the Confor Awards, he was on my table. They're just importing, let's say, 15 truck service technicians from South Africa, because they've realised by recruiting in Glasgow, Edinburgh, they're just stealing off the competitors. So they're stealing technicians from Scania or DAF or Renault or Mercedes. And then Mercedes will pinch one of their technicians, and it goes round in a circle. We don't have enough. So until somebody brings more in, they're not going to solve it. So they've got 15 fully qualified guys from South Africa, and it's not a short-term thing. This is like start a new life with Volvo in Scotland. So really refreshing. So hopefully that, you know, support network will step up as well and keep pace. Excellent. I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I know you're keen to drive up the road to Aberdeen.
HVO guys, look into it, please do. You can't buy it on the forecourts yet, but you can install a tank at your office or your depot, run your pickups on it, and look at the savings in emissions and CO2. It's really low hanging fruit, and battery electric hydrogen will come as technology develops. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to split. Thanks to April for organising. Thanks to Neil for chairing.
Thank you.
See you all again. Take care.
Thank you, Neil.
Cheers.
April's now going to give us a brief overview of the Scottish Finest Woods Awards, which I think entries close at the end of this month, so I shall leave to April to run through it.
Thank you very much, Neil. Can you just confirm that you can see the slides?
I can see the slides, yes.
Yeah, is that full screen?
It's sort of full screen.
Is it enough?
It's enough, yes. It depends on
Yeah,
how much other
okay.
things you've got open.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm just presenting today on behalf of Jean Nairn, as she'd like for us to give a shout out for Scotland's Finest Wood Awards. So these awards help celebrate the contribution that woodlands can make to people, the environment, and the economic prosperity of Scotland. Now, nominations and the categories for the awards opened in January, and this year the categories are Climate Change Champion, Community Woodland Award. This is for small groups, large groups, and it can include volunteers and staff involved. Farm Woodlands, so that's for young people aged 16 to 41. So that's all farm, croft woodlands, etc. We've got the New Native Woods category, Quality Timber, New Commercial Woods, Single Stand or Compartment of Small Woods, or Whole Forest Estate. And the Schools and Early Years category, so this is nursery, primary, secondary and special schools. Jean asked me to thank the supporters and delivery partners for the awards. So you can see there's a whole range of supporters who were involved. So big thanks to everybody involved that helps to deliver those awards. And as I say, they opened in January this year. We've got entries that will be closing on the 31st of March 2023 at just before midnight. So please can everybody consider putting in applications by that date. Thank you very much. I'll pass back to you now, Neil.
Brilliant, April. Thank you. Now we've got a presentation from Chris Quinn, who's the Chief Scientist at the Northern Research Station at Roslin for Forest Research. He's going to give us an overview and an update on Forest Research's work. I've got to say it's something that I've been pretty much out of the loop at, particularly through COVID, and I'm assured that they're doing a lot more in the background than probably most of us are aware of, so it'll be quite interesting to get an update. And please do throw some questions into the chat for Chris. It'd be good to get a bit of discussion around it as well afterwards. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Neil. And can you just confirm you can see my slides okay?
Yep, you're good there.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation, and kind of tempted to say this is something completely different from Neil's presentation, because I'm deliberately going to be very sort of broad and shallow rather than that very interesting kind of deep presentation around the alternatives to get us towards transportation and net zero. And looking at the names in the list of people attending, there's some old friends out there. It would have been fun to have been in a room to just chew the fat, as it were. Anyway, I'm going to just sort of break my kind of talk into three chunks, I suppose. One is just a kind of recap about forest research, because the world's moved on, and as Neil said, the pandemic sort of prevented some of us joining up, and I think we're probably a different organisation to the one that many of you encountered some years ago. Then I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about some of the science that's going on, the research highlights, and then talk a little bit in the third part around some of the outputs that we've been producing of late, and hopefully you'll be familiar with many of them. But if not, there'll be hopefully something that you can follow up afterwards. So, so those of you who aren't familiar with forest research, we're, I guess, the main research provider for trees, woods and forestry sector in the UK. We're an applied research organisation, a survivor of the breakup of the Forestry Commission, in that we were one of the areas of activity that it was agreed would be retained as a cross-border function. And what we do is, I suppose, support both policy and practice by conducting applied science and involving, as no doubt you've recognised, forestry has expanded in perhaps our understanding and meaning of it. And to support that in evidence, we've expanded the range of scientific disciplines that we call on to do that. We do still retain very much a sort of a network of field experimentation, genetic resources and data holdings. And we try and collaborate extensively, both in the UK and across Europe and increasingly further afield. We've got two main research sites. The closest to this region's interest is in the Northern Research Station, just outside Edinburgh, which is where I'm based much of the time. We also have our other main research station, Alice Holt, just outside of Farnham in southeast England. We have a presence in Bangor in Wales, and then a network of field stations that have provided the technical support that enables us to experiment and sample and measure across the wide range of bioclimatic situations that you find in GB. This sort of diagram is an attempt to sort of capture where we sit in the world of knowledge, I suppose, and that is we see ourselves really as an interface between policy and practitioners in the sector and the kind of broader body of knowledge that is being generated all the time through academics in universities and other research institutes. And we relatively speaking, have very little direct dealings with the public. We do that via yourselves in the policy and practice arena. But of course, knowledge exchange is a sort of rather more complex and less linear process than that first diagram implied. And so this is where I think just trying to illustrate the flows of knowledge. And I think that's probably one of the, I suppose, modern day phenomena in doing research is there's no longer the acceptance that there are sort of sole experts who produce information and cascade it out to people to use. It's actually much more around a dialogue and an exchange of information. What are you observing in your forests? What are the problems that you're encountering in your policy and your practice? And what's the dialogue that can then take place with researchers to work out the best ways of resolving those knowledge or evidence gaps? Our, I suppose, context for working changed very extensively with that full devolution of forestry that happened in 2018. And prior to that, there was a single Forestry Commission unit in Corstorphine, who were our main sort of funders and customers. And the research that was commissioned from us was dictated by them in dialogue with various other stakeholders. Now, as I said, we're retained as a cross-border function, but that means we have to respond to the research requirements and interests of Scotland, England and Wales. And so the first step along that kind of journey of post-devolution forestry science was the refresh of a science and innovation strategy. So that was coordinated by the Welsh Government, who provided the kind of secretariat to that and co-developed across GB, with each of the countries adopting their own way of engaging with their stakeholders to work out what were the priorities for Scotland, what were the priorities for Wales and England, and then coming together to try and distill those requirements into a way that balanced the interests of the countries and came up with something that was both relevant and achievable. And in doing so, they identified a set of outcomes that they were seeking from this science strategy, a set of broad themes, and then a more detailed listing of areas of research interest. And if you want to delve into the kind of detail of that, then that document that is illustrated on this slide is available on Welsh Government website and also through links from the Forest Research one. And here's a diagrammatic reflection of those outcomes and broad themes. So the set of circles in the middle of the diagram are the 4 key outcomes that they're seeing as desirable from a science and innovation strategy being implemented. So, I mean, the obvious thing perhaps might be an improved evidence base, but there's no point in having evidence for evidence sake. That has to feed through to an increase of knowledge and understanding of the people who want to make use of that, so that policy and practice is informed by science. And then all of that depends and cross-fertilizes into a skilled research community and a national capability. And then the 4 blobs around the 7 blobs around the outside are the core themes that they identified, ranging from the kind of obvious focus on tree health and biosecurity to some of the challenges of resource assessment and sector monitoring that includes the likes of national statistics and the National Forest Inventory. So in responding to that science and innovation strategy, we've identified 7 core programs matching each of those themes. They're resourced at different levels, and the work that is done within them responds to the descriptions in the strategy, it responds to the opportunities for ongoing work, and then also looks for leverage through additional funding. And so I've identified the fact that the 4 outcomes are supported not just by the 7 core programs, but they're supported by work that's funded through other research funders, and indeed research done by other research providers and other research organisations. So that the strategy is something much broader than just a set of core programs. And one of I think the really interesting developments at the moment is with the topicality of trees and woods and forests, then there is actually more funding available than there has been for probably a couple of decades from other resources, but not from the core. And just to kind of mention, because I think people do occasionally suggest that, you know, they're frustrated that some of the things that we used to do are no longer being done, and they don't quite understand why that is the case. And in a way, this slide just attempts to explain that the core funding for us as an organisation has been flatlined since 2015, and that followed a cut of 25% of funding in the period 2010 to 2015. So inevitably, some of the things that people got used to perhaps early in their career have had to disappear. But you know, the response, the obvious response, is to diversify your funding sources, and that is typically done through time-bound grants and contracts, and those have both pros and cons. The pros being the very focused attention to requirements that the funder has dictated and is seeking particular outputs or outcomes. The con, in a way, the biggest con is how to maintain long-term continuity and how to develop skills and succession that often takes years to foster. How do you do that when you're getting a succession of short-term grants? And I can't have to just point out that the lack of sector funding generally is really quite an omission. And I know it's something that has been discussed several times in terms of voluntary contributions and levies, but it's quite remarkable if you contrast the situation in the UK compared to the likes of Sweden, Norway, Australia and New Zealand, where there's some very substantial contributions made. And I think that really helps with the very operational and practical research as part of the portfolio. So just to sort of summarise the mix of funding that Forest Research currently has, you'll see that the kind of core funding, as we regard it, is almost reduced to about a third of what it takes to run the agency of the current size. We've been very fortunate in recent years to get an uplift of funding direct from Forestry Commission for work in England, and from DEFRA in support of their England Tree Action Plan and Nature for Climate Fund. We also get funding direct from Scottish Forestry and Forestry and Land Scotland, also Welsh Government and NRW. And then the external funding on this table is primarily from UKRI, which is research councils by want of another name, and then a very modest nowadays contribution from through collaborative projects within the EU. Some of the highlights of this sort of diversification of investment lately has been capital investment by DEFRA in some of our facilities, both quarantine laboratories and science capital, and then through collaborative partnerships around a Centre for Forest Protection. We've also had these new opportunities through the UKRI, the research councils, and in particular the UK Treescapes programme, and some of you may follow some of those projects on social media or see the launch conferences of that. And then the international opportunities are still there, although some of the mechanisms, as you'll probably be aware of, how you engage in EU projects is currently a kind of live discussion. Just an example of some of this investment. This is our site at Alice Holt with the new larch clad quarantine facility, the Holt Laboratory, that's just been completed in the last couple of years and has transformed our ability to work on some of the pests and diseases that we definitely don't want to see getting established in the UK. And we can consider how best to diagnose them, and we can look at some of their host specificity in a set of safe laboratory spaces in this facility. Quick snapshot of the inside when it was squeaky clean, and before the samples of Ips typographus and some of the Phytophthora started arriving, and at which point we have to start restricting access quite considerably to it. But that's a really welcome investment, and part of that is to underpin the importance of the domestic timber market, but also the risks of continuing global trade in plants and plant products. So that is, I suppose, just a very brief kind of saunter through forest research in the round. And then I thought I'd just spend a few minutes talking about some of the science that we're underpinning. Now, obviously, it's really hard to do it justice in a short period of time, but I suppose just want to give you a flavour of what's going on. And I think if any of it captures your imagination and you want to hear about it more in depth, then please mention it to April and colleagues, and we can look to provide speakers to delve into that in a much more detail. I'll also try and answer any questions on that kind of science portfolio if there are any immediately. And I thought I'd just pick particularly on the fact that I suppose the developments in particular have been around how best to start expanding the resolution of long-term monitoring, how best to pull together in models and other ways of synthesizing evidence. That's I think a modern trend to the demands for evidence often place on those two, I suppose, dimensions. And then there's this sort of whole suite of new techniques that are possible now and transforming our ability to look at what's going on in forests. And that's either from remote sensing or through techniques such as environmental DNA. And again, just some snapshots of some of the remote sensing work. This is a slide produced by colleague Juan Suarez, and he's really trying to illustrate here the fusion of data that you can get from different remote sensing methods. So from airborne, satellite-based, and then ground-based terrestrial laser. And this is, I think, transforming ability to, certainly in a research sense, profile stands to a much greater degree. And the challenge now is to sort of operationalize that data fusion techniques to transform the characterization of forests at the sort of regional and national scale. There's also the opportunity to use remote sensing for short-term rapid response monitoring. And this is a slide from the work that was done in the immediate aftermath of Storm Arwen just over 15 months ago. And those of you who know me will know that a long time ago I used to work on Windthrow, and in those days trying to capture the change of Windthrow from one year to the next was through commissioning annual aerial photography, and that just integrated a whole suite of storms that might happen. Whereas now with remote sensing and frequent passes of satellites, it's possible to capture the impacts of individual storms. And so I kind of rather wish I was a Windthrow researcher now, because I think there's real opportunities to learn a lot more about impacts of individual storms. And so this is just a snapshot from the Ettrick Valley of some of the very early detection using synthetic aperture radar. And then those initial estimates were provided to policymakers who were trying to understand the immediate impact of the storm, and then were refined over time with new satellite coverage. And I think that's now been a sort of progress in method development that would enable a much more rapid and refined response if we were to start getting storms again this winter or next winter. There's also developments in using remote sensing and again different platforms to monitor both clear felling change detection, which plugs into the national statistics and national forest inventory, but also increasingly to look at the success or otherwise of restocking that is being linked to those felling. Another form of synthesis, not so much remote sensing, but using different data sets to start to crunch down to represent very complex phenomena through some simple, hopefully robust statistics. And here an example of some work they've been doing for the public forest estate, looking at how to construct biodiversity indicators or multiple criteria of biodiversity indicators, so that monitoring and progress of change in the impacts of woodland structure and composition can be assessed over time. And just one graphic to represent environmental DNA, so eDNA, so the animals in the left-hand circle of this Venn diagram are the ones that were captured using static cameras on sites, and the ones that are in the right-hand circle are ones that have been captured by taking surface soil samples at the same location, extracting DNA and linking that to the online databases that take a DNA fingerprint and tell you what organism it is. And this is a hugely rapidly advancing topic. I guess we've all become somewhat more familiar with the ability to undertake DNA sampling with the sort of COVID testing that's been done by each of us over recent times, but the ability now is shifting not just from direct samples from organisms through to this the indirect sampling and into soils as well. So it's providing a real opportunity to open up the world of soil biodiversity and soil organisms. Given the title of the group, I didn't think it would have been remiss not to mention that, of course, there is still some really solid work going on in the field and laboratory testing timber properties, both in the main species and in some of the emerging species. And we have facilities that we've developed over time at NRS in collaboration with the CERT partnership, and still doing some important, I think, collaborative work on that. So I guess just to sort of begin to summarize, then I think there's quite a spectrum of outputs and outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. And I think sometimes people don't appreciate just the breadth of work that there is that can be found or can be accessed through what we do. At the left-hand side of this diagram, I've got the sort of typical ways of sharing knowledge, the outputs, as it were. And that's in the middle, I've got some of the mechanisms by which we construct that. But what we're seeking really are the outcomes on the right-hand side. So by providing evidence which may be coming from models and decision support systems, ultimately as an applied research organisation, what we're seeking is to see stronger evidence that's available for policy and practice, helping you make better decisions and improving the skills base. And so there's a sort of variety of routes by which that can be done, and research working towards the impact of research and outcomes rather than simply outputs is a feature of our current activity. Having said that, I'm just going to mention some of the outputs that have come out in recent times, just in case you haven't spotted them in the sort of trade journal articles or news releases that we've seen. So here's a mix of some of the outputs that have been coming out in the last 24 months. And I think in its own way illustrates the breadth of the research agenda that we're trying to cover. So work on resilience, work on flood risk, on valuing non-woodland trees, the 25-year forecast of softwood timber availability, work on why access to nature is so important to people, and particularly at times of pandemics, and then a practice guide on how to adapt forest and woodland management to the changing climate. And finally, a snapshot of something, a film crew from Countryfile who came and visited our site at Alice Holt and looked at some of the work being done on greenhouse gas fluxes in the Straits enclosure. That adaptation guide, the climate change adaptation guide, is now being, I suppose, backed up and supported and expanded through a climate change hub. And this was a response to stakeholders saying that they just needed access, greater access to the breadth of material that is there to support the decisions around how to change policy and practice in the light of the climate change crisis. And so last month, I think it was, the Climate Change Hub was launched, and it's an attempt to pull together the multiple strands of information that people would find useful to access. This is the sort of homepage for it, and here's an example of the set of risks that it's trying to provide content on. Some familiar ones there, obviously regionally different in their frequency and severity, but accessing the profiling of risks, and then also providing a whole set of links to the resources, whether it's the decision support tools themselves, some of the climate change fact sheets, a 2-page simple digest that we've tried to produce, videos around adaptation, set of case studies and publications and news. And that hub is now going to, I suppose, expand, will increase the content, and would be very keen to get the feedback from users of it. Another presence online is through Tree Alert. And again, this is something that I hope you're familiar with, but this actually first came out immediately after ash dieback first became spotted, and we realized that without structuring the sort of helpful advice and inquiries people were trying to give, and the material and identification that they had, we could very readily get swamped by actually stuff that was almost a distraction. Whereas by structuring things through a web portal, it was possible to get members of the public, citizen scientists, observatory volunteers to provide some really good quality early detection and surveillance material, observations. And this is just being upgraded this year to allow monitoring not just of or reporting of not just of unhealthy trees, but monitoring of healthy trees over time, so that could be used as a way of logging sentinel trees. It's integral to the observatory volunteer network that some of you may be familiar with, and it's a key source of data for our diagnostics and advisory team, allowing them to spot patterns of disease and pest occurrence, get early warning from that, and occasionally people log really concerning symptoms that are genuinely novel, and the teams will then go out and look at what is underlying that and spot the very early occurrence of things. I guess a sense that perhaps it could be used more significantly by professionals, and so just put that question mark, greater use by professionals. So just to sort of briefly recap, I guess Forest Research is very much keen to be an applied research organisation that serves the needs of the forest sector in the round, whether you're interested in urban trees, whether you have woodlands or large-scale commercial forests. And we do that through practicing what we would call, and maybe it's a bit of a geeky term, interdisciplinary research. That means pulling together expertise from different disciplines, from different perspectives, to try and provide integrated answers. And so the examples would be making use of social scientists and economists, as well as natural scientists and forest scientists, to come up with, for example, advice on climate change adaptation. We're very keen on knowledge exchange and achieving impact. So we don't just see ourselves as people who sort of push information out and just assume it works. We are keen to get feedback, we're keen to get ideas, and we're keen to hear about where you're trialing things. I think that's one of the growth areas potentially, is the sort of within site experimentation and adaptation, adaptive management that managers are beginning to do, how we could make better use of that. And we are particularly interested in outcomes rather than outputs. That might seem a bit semantic, really, but at the end of the day, it's not about publishing the paper or publishing the practice guide. It's about whether in publishing that and in sharing that knowledge, then people's perspectives on how they manage their land can be changed and improved. We think that we do a lot to keep in touch, but people regularly tell us we could do better. So on the right-hand side of the slide, I've just put some of the ways that I think people can keep in touch with what we're up to. That ranges from online seminars, which hopefully are advertised, and you can join or access the recordings. We've developed the website more, and we still have plans to increase the content on that. And then there's a whole set of publications, social media, conference attendance, training days. And we do have regular liaison meetings with Confor to try and identify areas of interest or concern that are developing. But do get in touch with ideas, interest, and opportunities. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Friends, get any queries, they can raise their hand as well. And anything else for Chris?
Getting being let off lightly. I'm fine.
Just comprehensive presentation.
It's great. Thanks for the opportunity, and people are very welcome to contact myself or come through April. We have regular catch-ups, and as I say, it's quite challenging giving a snapshot of what 300 people are doing, in the space of 25 minutes. There's a lot of detail that others would be much better at going into, and you'd be very welcome to invite them along.